everyone. I'm going to get us started. Kyla and I are going to welcome you into this space, into this Juneteenth kickoff. And I wanted to talk about, as Nyla said, why it's a kickoff. And it is because we are hoping to start this weekend of celebration with some learning and understanding. For some of you, this will be things that you know already very well. For others, it will be an introduction to information. But the hope is that we all leave here ready to share this with others and to bring others into this fight and struggle. I'm Dr. Kyra Greene. I'm the Executive Director at the Center on Policy Initiatives. As you heard, we are the fiscal sponsor for the San Diego Black Workers Center. And I want to just say a little bit about how I come into this space, what I am and what I am not. So I am not an expert on Juneteenth. I am not an expert on slavery. But what I am is a person who has dedicated my entire career to trying to understand under what conditions do people who have been told that they do not matter, that they are small and powerless and unimportant, under what conditions do they decide to organize and fight and win? That means I have a commitment to studying movements by women, people of color, especially Black people, and movements led and won by people with disabilities. But underneath it all, I have a commitment to understanding what working people do and why they do what they do. The other thing that brings me here is that I am a Black woman whose ancestors were enslaved people, and then people who lived through and continue to live through the Southern systems of racism. I am someone for whom Juneteenth is both a celebration of my racial heritage and a day for all working people to acknowledge that ultimately ending slavery in this country was a win for workers, which means that Juneteenth is not just a Black holiday, it is a labor holiday. It is an understanding that slavery was about completely controlling the lives of Black people so that Black people's labor could be controlled and managed. So with that is what we're going to bring to you. What did this emancipation actually mean for Black people? I think there's a lot of myths about both slavery and about emancipation. So in terms of emancipation, people often say Black people were freed when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1st, 1863. But this is in fact not true. Although the official proclamation was issued in 1863, it was issued only as a partial freeing of Black people. Rather than freeing all enslaved Black people, it actually freed only people in the Confederate South, so only in Confederate states that were in rebellion, which were not the only states that had enslavement of Black people. It left people enslaved in states that were loyal to the Union, and it left people enslaved in places the Union Army had already taken over. So even in places that had been in rebellion from the Union, if those were already under Union control, people were not emancipated under this act. I think that's an important thing because the idea that the intention was simply the liberation of Black people is not true. It was actually a mechanism for winning war. It was a recognition that the South's power was dependent on the labor that enslaved people were providing, and that is why they were able to sustain their effort in the Civil War. And that by removing that access to that labor, by encouraging people to self-emancipate, which is what was actually required, right? Nobody was going to come and free people. It said you are free, and then you have to take action to realize that. And that declaration that people should continue self-emancipation was actually about empowering the Union Army, allowing them to win. So even that win, I think that's really important, that often people who are not aligned with us will tell us the North freed the slaves, and that is not the story of the facts of the situation. So I have a dream about today. And the dream I have is that this weekend you're gonna go out and people are gonna be celebrating Juneteenth. And like many of us, some people are gonna know a lot of this history, but most people will not. And they will believe a lot of myths. And my hope is that you will leave this space with information that you can share to people as you talk to them about what the meaning of this holiday is. And so underneath that, what I hope you're telling them is that Black history is American history. What should be abundantly clear is you cannot tell the story of this country without the story of Black people. And I'm gonna go a step further and say something very controversial. I say all the time if I can be raised in a country that can teach me that white men who enslaved people were my ancestors, were my founding fathers, were my forefathers, then everybody in this country can understand that they have inherited the struggle of black people. That the freedoms that every one of us has, the fact that any one of us has free labor is dependent on the fact that black people struggled to say that labor could not be, for the most part, there are exceptions as my brother told us, could not be enslaved labor, that we would have to have rights. And that is underneath, and so I hope you're telling everyone this is a holiday that everyone ought to take a moment and have reverence for the ancestors and what they have left for all of us. To do that, it means we have to understand black emancipation as both a civil rights struggle and a labor struggle. So let's talk a little bit about what slavery looked like. Because one of the first myths I was taught growing up in Kentucky and Tennessee was that somehow slavery was not that bad. That it was better, they would show us pictures, I'm telling y'all the truth, they would show us pictures of people suffering in Africa, and they would say, see, you live in this country. And you have, and they would tell us all kinds, you have clothes and you have cars, and that's because this country was a good place. And actually, slave owners weren't violent towards the people that they owned. Why would they? I literally had a teacher tell me once, you treat your car nice because it's your car. You don't want it to break down. And that's how people treated the people they enslaved, because they didn't want them to break down. Well, exactly. Yes. The part where I'm a person, not a car. But that means that this is a lie about what the nature of slavery was. So the first enslaved Africans, at least that we have a historical record of, were brought to the US in 1619. US slavery, another way to talk about it so that it has resonance to what happens today, is that it was labor trafficking. It was labor trafficking and labor exploitation. The point of it was to move people from one place in the world to another under the most inhumane conditions, to force them to labor far from home, and they were less empowered because they couldn't just escape to another place. This was an intentional decision to remove people so that they would be forced into this system. We also were taught, when I was a kid, that people who were enslaved, even that they wanted it, that they were the kind of people that were too docile. And we might say, like, that's really insulting, but honestly, some of us who think of ourselves as liberated people, we have a version of this. We say, couldn't be me. But it could be us. Because what is true is that if you understand slavery, it was a brutal and inhumane system. It was in place for over 240 years. There were people who were born, lived their entire lives under slavery, never knew anyone who had not been enslaved in their family, right? And still they had to imagine a version of freedom. It's hard, it should be hard for us to imagine a system that would be willing to separate children from their parents. It should be hard to imagine a system that said that black people have no rights, not even to their own bodies. It should be hard to imagine a system that uses sexual violence against people, and then the people who commit that violence are enslaving their own children. All of that should be hard to imagine, but is it really? If you think about the world that you live in right now, is it hard to imagine a system that separates children from their parents? Is it hard to imagine a system that moves people from one place where they live their whole lives to another place where they know no one? Right? We live in a system that's doing that right now in terms of the treatment of immigrants and people that we claim are immigrants. So that has two things. It means, one, the evil is still alive in the world, but it also means that the story we're telling about black people is not a story that stays just with black people. It is the same story that impacts everyone in the world once you believe that people can be used for whatever purposes for their labor and that they don't have a right to their own freedom and freedom of movement. There is to me, there is direct parallels between a system of rules around immigration and the system of enslavement. To Kyle's point about the lack of freedom of movement and the right to be where you want to be free. It is also important to know that with black labor, without black labor, we could not have had the system we wanted to. And black people were resisting the entire time. Let me just say a little bit about what kind of labor they were producing before I go and talk about this resistance. The work done by Black enslaved people was mostly house and domestic work, right? And field and farm work. I want you to hold on to that as we go through the rest of this presentation about what types of work Black people did under systems of enslavement and what is currently true about people who do that same type of work in our economy. Today, what you will see, if you think about the work that's done by people who work in fields, who feed people, who clothe people, who take care of the young and the elderly, who provide health care, often this is the work that is highly surveilled, right? Now, the overseer isn't necessarily a person. It might be a piece of software. It might be an app on your phone, for example. It might be a clock that measures how many pieces of mail you've moved in a minute. Highly surveilled. It is still work that is poorly paid, often talked about as being unskilled labor. The solution, again, even among people who would not just define themselves as white supremacists, if that labor is poorly paid, what should people do? Attention to the idea of why. Why is that work that is critical, feeding people, caring for people, right? That is critical human labor. There is no justification for it being low wage except that we've already historically accepted that all the way back to slavery. And here's what should also scare everybody. It is the work that is most likely to survive this AI disruption. So even as machines come in, what work will be left for the rest of us to do if we do not intervene in this system is exactly the work that, if we're not careful, we have agreed is work that doesn't need to be well paid, doesn't need to be respected. So what work will there be that will have human dignity attached to it if it's not this fundamental work that is so human that in many cases we can't even imagine a machine being able to do that work? So it's also proof that just because labor is critical and fundamental to the system working it has nothing to do with the power of workers, how important the work is. What determines the power of workers is the ability to organize, work collectively, and turn over oppression, right? Turn it back. So that's what it's gonna take, is that kind of organizing. Let's talk about the kinds of restrictions, how I know that slavery was about suppressing the ability of workers to organize. I want you to hear that. If you understand what labor organizing is, I want you to understand slavery as a system designed to fight organized labor the same way we have new systems that do the same thing. How do you do that? From the start, enslaved people were resisting slavery. It's not hard to imagine why they would want to do that. In fact, historians have identified hundreds, at least 250 to 330 times or more, where 10 or more enslaved people took action that was intended to result in freedom. And newspaper accounts of that time called them, I want to see if you hear any echoes, called those plots and uprisings, right? Labeled those as the things that were plots, not the system of enslavement, but the system of trying to liberate oneself. In addition, there's evidence that there were tons of smaller actions that workers took day in and day out. There were work slowdowns, these small forms of resistance, breaking of tools so they couldn't be forced to work, and attempted and successful escapes. It is clear that escapes were common, that resistance was common, because there was extreme punishment of these types of violations of the order. So these pictures you see of a person with a bell around their neck, this is a person who's tried to escape, so they're forced to wear a bell so they can be heard wherever they move. You don't create that kind of technology, that kind of machinery, unless you have a system where you know that many people desire to leave that system and escape from it. Punishment for resistance to slavery was extremely violent. I want you to tell people about the violence of this system. People who were caught trying to escape were beaten, they had body parts amputated, they were put in devices like that bell to discourage future attempts. People who organized action, whether violent or nonviolent attempts to free themselves and others, were tortured and killed. And even when people reached quote unquote freedom in the North or Canada, they could be seized and sent back to slavery. And some of the people who were seized were not even enslaved. They had already been freed through other systems. And they were still deported and enslaved. I use that word intentionally. Further evidence of how clear it was that Black people resisted enslavement is shown by how many laws and rules were created restricting Black freedom. Some of the forms of freedom that were restricted were things like access to reading, because people who can read and people who can write can organize, can communicate across wide swaths of space to organize for their freedom. There were restrictions on freedom of movement, because people who can go where they want to and talk to whomever they want to can do what? Organize. They can organize. And therefore, the final restriction is on the right to assembly. Literally, this gathering, look around you, look at who you are and who you're with. This, under slavery, is an illegal assembly. You cannot have, frankly, this many Black people together in a room. Because there was an understanding of the people in that system that if you allowed that to happen, people's desire for freedom was so great that they would begin to organize against that system of enslavement. So it was not one that anybody was happy with, content with, thought was better than the alternatives available to them. There's also a myth that people have about this, that Juneteenth is just about the freeing of labor in the South. That the system of slavery was just about what was happening to people in the South. It's important to note that labor in the North was not free in the ways that is often described to us. The work that was done by a relatively small, free Black population was also being done by immigrants, white immigrants in the North. And neither of those populations were desirable populations to people in the North. They were tolerated for their labor, but it's not like the people in the North were like, hey, all y'all Black people in the South, come on. We want you here, right? There's a reason why that system, we saw some forms of resistance to deporting people from the North, but there were not states organizing and resisting folks coming into their borders and taking people away. And for white workers in the North, there were two pathways that they might have adopted under this system of oppression. One option is embrace racism. So, and that was the more common choice, was to embrace racist notions of white supremacy and help enforce the oppression of Black people and be rewarded with conditions that were often quite bad, but better than Black people. This is an important thing to have, because sometimes when we enter in these discussions about the history of slavery, people will say, my ancestors were also poor people in the North, immigrants who worked there. And I think the question you still have to ask is, number one, who cares? I mean, honestly, it was all bad and we are where we are right now. But the second is that if people were not actively resisting that system, if they were embracing it, taking advantage of the slight advantages of it, that is how that system is upheld. So reminding people that it's not just being the owner of people. It is not just you have to directly be working, I don't know, for ICE. If you are standing by willing to benefit from the impacts of it, you are helping to maintain that system and you are complicit in that situation. And you do so, as white people in the North did, at your own peril. Because by agreeing to uphold that system where conditions were bad, they actually limited their ability to achieve true liberation for themselves as well. They were willing to accept working conditions that had they done the second option, which is choose solidarity, had white workers and Black workers been able to come together consistently and resist oppression, we might live in a very different society, and one where it wasn't so hard to pay the bills. So the lesson to us today is that solidarity is rare but powerful. And we should remember that race has always been used to separate working people from one another by the bosses who were actually the ones who benefited by that division. Those with power know it is easier to keep us oppressed if we are fighting or just separating ourselves from one another, right? We see that today in the fights of, are we gonna fight for Black liberation or are we gonna deal with immigration challenges? First of all, ignoring that there are Black immigrants. And second of all, missing the point that it is one struggle. We are going to liberate ourselves together or we're not. All right, so Kyla's talked about this, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it, but just to say that Juneteenth, my point is that Juneteenth is therefore a labor holiday. But it was not, there's so much that I think in what Kyle covered, that's so disappointing about what it really was, how few people were liberated, what it took. But there's something that I find slightly, dare to, inspirational about that. Here's what I find inspirational. I find it inspirational that people decided to celebrate Juneteenth because it's about appreciating a win, even when that win is delayed by 2.5 years, even when that win is incomplete. And it was an incomplete win. One of the other ways it was incomplete is that most people were not actually freed until the 13th Amendment passed, which actually freed almost all the rest of Black people. But as our brother reminded us, encapsulated the idea that people who are convicted of a crime can still be enslaved. And it is still happening in this country today. It is still the case that people who are incarcerated can be paid a sub-minimum wage. Now, there are people who will tell you that that's okay, they broke the law, that's justified. I obviously do not agree with that. But let me tell you about the impacts beyond the person who is incarcerated. A family member who is incarcerated, who has children, do they have wages that they can use to pay child support? No, not if they're working within that system, but not making any money. Let me ask you a question. Is there something, when you hear about products that are being made by people who are incarcerated, is it a lower quality product? So somebody's making money. I'm sorry?
$2 billion annually.
$2 billion annually. And let me tell you a clear story about how this is something that's alive in this county right now. When I came to work at CPI, we were doing work on the county budget. We opened up the county's charter and its set of principles, financial practices. And it had exactly one law that the county had passed separately from state or federal as it applied to labor. And that one labor policy was that the county would prioritize purchasing its products, prioritize contracting with the California Department of Corrections. So written right into our county law was a decision to use enslaved labor. Right? And technically, it's still on the books. That is why we are constantly talking about the idea that when we're saying this is not just history. History is being made right now, every day, and there is still a fight against enslavement that we need to be having. Even when I say that the win was incomplete, I want you to remember that quickly after this, laws were put in place, like Black codes, that continue to replicate the restrictions on Black people's freedom and movement, Jim Crow laws that restricted people's right to vote. I don't know if y'all heard, but they're on it again. Think for a minute. When is the last time you sat in a room and you thought about yourself as a worker? What your rights were as a worker? Who you were as a worker? How you could be with others and build power as a worker? I think for most of us, we're lucky we're in a house of labor where people do that every day here at an organization like SDA. But for most of us, it's not the identity that we're encouraged to lean into and to think of as a source of power. And I want to say that the Center on Policy Initiative, part of what we're committed to doing is making sure that people understand that this is an identity that we can be proud of, right? We know that the source of power, first thing that has to happen is we have to liberate ourselves. We have to not be ashamed of an identity. We have to embrace it and understand it. And I think if we kept having this conversation, what we would realize is that we actually, bear with me, you might get a little mad, we actually love to work. And not in a bad way. If you hang out with little kids, they want to work. They want to help build, they want to clean, they want to serve, they want to do things. It is not the working that is the dysfunction. It's the exploitation of that basic human need to create and to build and to be. Having that turned into something that's exploited by someone else for profit, that is what creates the dysfunction that we're talking about. It's not the productivity itself, it's what drives it. It's that productivity being driven by fear. And I want to talk about why it's driven by fear. So we've talked so far about labor exploitation, we've talked about slavery and the relationship to it, and then we've talked about the fact that there are parallels today. There's echoes of that history that we continue to see. But I want to make it clear that there are two ways that, at least, that I'm going to talk about tonight, that are how these things continue to live on. Why? What's the process by which they survive? And so the first is that it is about the ideology of oppression towards service workers. More and more of our economy is service work, right? More and more of what we do is provide and every day to make a living is to provide some service to others. But the history of this country, in terms of the narrative and the structure of it, is that domestic work, service work, is associated with two types of people, historically. Women, and, as we've talked about, it's encapsulated in the history of slavery and association with Black people. Because of its early association with those two groups of people, it has been treated as unskilled and unworthy of decent pay and working conditions. To recognize that women, especially women of color, are at the core of our economy and at the core of our survival as people would turn the whole order of our society upside down. If we understood that if we judged work in the economy by how much the work contributed to our health and well-being, rather than how much it extracted from our environment and our communities, we live in a very different system. A care-based economy wouldn't allow for homelessness and hunger. A care-based economy would judge the value, how well is this economy doing? How well is this economic system solving our problem? By how well it eradicated homelessness, hunger, want, fear. The devaluing of women, and especially women of color, doesn't just impact those of us who are women or people of color, it impacts anyone who does this type of work. I want to make sure everyone's hearing me. It does not matter, when you go have this conversation with people, you need to make sure that they understand it does not matter what their race is or their gender. It doesn't matter how long their family has lived in this country. If you are a worker doing the kind of work that has historically been done by enslaved people and or women, then you are harmed by racism and sexism in this system. And the fight against those things are your fight. And that is because, the next thing, that oppression is encoded in our legal system. So let's talk about how that happens. First of all, the first thing I'm going to talk about is, sorry, I got all excited. In 1935, we passed the National Labor Relations Act. This law recognized the right of employees to organize and to collectively bargain. When you describe that work that you did with your coworkers to get together, right? You did this outside of a legal framework, but it is still the two things. What did you describe? You worked, you got together, you organized yourselves, and then you collectively bargained with your boss to set up the kind of schedule that you wanted. So this law was designed to make sure that workers had this right. But who was excluded from this law? It excluded agricultural workers, anyone who provided home care or worked for a parent or spouse. That is racist discrimination against farm workers, and racist and sexist discrimination against domestic workers was encoded into our labor law. It was made possible by the power of the bosses to influence the law, right? It's not like domestic workers or farm workers went and said, hey, could you pass a law that excludes me from this right to organize? And it was also possible because of a lack of solidarity among organized labor at the time. right? If all organized labor had said, we won't accept the exclusion of some set of workers, it is possible that there could have been resistance to passing a law like that. So this is 1935. Another law that continues to influence the impact of workers in the service economy was the 1935 Social Security Act. This act created a social safety net for working families. It was a recognition that in a capitalist system, there were going to be certain kinds of people consistently who were not going to have their needs met. In other words, that capitalism consistently creates unemployment, right? So unemployment is not a flaw of the person. Unemployment is recognized in that moment as part of the system, and therefore you need a solution to those periods of unemployment. So there's unemployment insurance. Second, there was a recognition that the system was built to have two workers if you were going to have both people able to go externally and earn wages, and then people to provide the domestic work for free inside their own homes. So who was going to need a system? You needed welfare programs for widowed women with children and people with disabilities who could not themselves enter into that workforce, right? This is like a recognition of who. And then there was an idea that people shouldn't have to work for wages their whole lives, that they would age, and that they would need some security in their older years, and so there was Social Security created. But did you know that there are people excluded from Social Security? Domestic workers and farm workers were excluded from Social Security retirement. The colorblind and non-racist explanation was domestic work and farm work were excluded because it was often day work and or work in homes or on farms, so it was harder to collect the taxes from those jobs. So that becomes the justification for why those folks are not incorporated into that social safety net program. But even back then, let's be clear, people understood that this was a racist policy. Because Charles Heston from the NAACP highlighted that excluding these occupations would have the impact of excluding most black workers. So there was a direct recognition that this was a law that was going to mean that black people were going to pay into a system, but be unlikely to support a government that then ran a series of programs that would be more likely to exclude them than other workers. Today, these same exclusions not only impact black workers, especially in the US South, but in places like California, it disproportionately impacts Latin workers and Asian and Pacific Islander workers who are currently concentrated in domestic and farm work. In other words, for once, the person who is currently the President of the United States says something both racist in his intention, but also accurate. When he said, what happened to the black jobs? They're going to other people. He said it the right thing for the wrong reason. Continuing this history of excluding service workers, sometimes it doesn't work and then sometimes it really works. In 1938, there was the Fair Labor Standards Act. This law set a minimum wage and created overtime pay requirements for work. But in the 1930s, the Southern economy was still highly dependent on farm workers and domestic workers. Do you hear what I'm going? This same service economy? And so Southern lawmakers wanted to ensure that they kept those workers underpaid and exploited. As a result, farm workers and domestic workers were excluded from these protections. It is a fact that in this country, from 1938 until 2013, home care workers fought to right this wrong, to ensure that they would at least make a minimum wage and would be eligible for overtime. And it was President Obama who extended minimum wage and overtime protections to home care workers. That took 75 years of struggle for this basic labor protection. I mention these things because creating different levels of benefit for different people is a common tactic of people with power. Those with power have learned that one way to divide us is to make it so that we see each other as competition. Why do you have this thing and I don't? But when we have a labor force that's all united in ensuring that everybody has equal rights, we are powerful. The last thing I'm going to leave you with is this. there are going to be people who come to you and say, we can solve this problem, and the way we should solve this problem is by passing colorblind policies. Stop talking so much about race. There are a lot of reasons this is wrong, but this is the one that sticks out to me as we kick off Juneteenth. We implemented Juneteenth as a federal holiday, but we did so in a way that did not recognize the racial impacts of implementing it the way we have other labor laws. So it is a research-proven fact that Black workers are going to be more likely to be at work on Friday for Juneteenth than white workers in many, many industries. And in particular, it is going to be Black workers who work in service jobs who will be serving people who have the day off. Let me give you a clear example of how you know this is true. You don't have to believe me. You're like, who's that lady? I don't know her. Think about, as a federal holiday, the requirement is only the federal government has to allow people to have the day off and pay them. For other employers, it is optional. So, companies. I'll give you an example. Look at this chart. What it's showing us is what are the kind of jobs where Black people are overrepresented in those occupations. So if we think in retail industry, in service jobs, although Black people are only 12% of the population, there's 17% of the population in service jobs, 17% of the cashiers, 13% of the salespeople, but only 8.6% of the people in managerial roles. Okay? So, I'm gonna name some companies. I buy their products, but I still hate them. At Apple, on Friday, will the Apple store be open? Will they be selling phones? Will corporate headquarters at Apple be open? Where are Black people going to be working? In the store. And who's going to have the day off at the corporate? And you can do this in any industry you want to. On Friday, will McDonald's be open? Yeah. Will corporate headquarters at McDonald's be open? Where are Black workers more likely to be working? Right? On Friday, will Target be open? Will people? Not for me. I won't be able. Right? But you get what I'm saying? You can go through industry after industry. And that is why, if your intention was to honor the sacrifice and freedom of Black people, you would actually have a conversation about how to institute a holiday in a way that was attentive to ensuring at the very least Black people had an equal right to celebrate that holiday on the same day. And you would probably not design it in such a way that Black people would end up in service jobs serving people in ways that replicate this system. So I'm not trying to ruin your enjoyment of the holiday. I'm trying to give us work, right? That the way that we show love is by moving our feet and fighting to fix problems. And so this is our charge. Then I'm gonna leave it to Kyle because he's gonna preach and then we're gonna go home. All right, so our charge this Juneteenth, I have two things I wanna ask you to do. If this night has been impactful for you, here's the thing I want you to do. One, I want you to make sure that you're part of a fight against this federal administration's attempts to take this kind of information out of our schools. Whether it's resisting having this in our K through 12 schools or shutting down Africana Studies departments and Ethnic Studies department, it is this type of knowledge that they are trying to stop us from having and sharing because it makes us powerful to have it. So the next time you hear someone say they have a problem with DEI, I want you to remember that's what we've done tonight. And we have to fight for this. The second thing is that I want you to have conversations, to commit to have at least 5 conversations with people where you teach them something you learned or remembered tonight. In particular, there are going to be opportunities around the fact that in about a month, less than a month, we're going to be talking about the 250th celebration of independence. And the question I want you to bring to all those discussions is independence for whom? Who's free? And to Kyle's point, who is not? And what are we committing to do to make a different reality?